$3. That's all Leanne Tam had left in her coin purse when she stepped off the freight wagon into the dust of Silver Bend, Nevada in the summer of 1876. She had not meant to end up here. She had meant to end up somewhere with a roof that did not leak and a name that did not make shopkeepers go quiet when she gave it. But her husband was 6 weeks in the ground outside Reno, killed when a grading crew blasted a hillside too close to the rail line, and the foreman who signed his pay had told her, not unkindly, that a widow's claim on a dead man's wages was a matter for the company office in San Francisco. She did not have the fare to San Francisco. She had the fare to Silver Bend, and a letter of reference from the minister at the rail camp that she suspected would do her no good at all. The town was busier than she expected. Wagons choked the main street, freighters shouting at each other over the price of grain, a blacksmith's hammer ringing out under the awning of a livery, dust rising in slow gold clouds under every wheel and hoof that passed. Leanne walked the boardwalk with her carpet-bag in both hands, reading the signs above the doors. General store, land office, a boarding house with a card in the window that said, "No vacancy," though a woman inside watched her through the glass with an expression that said the vacancy would not have been for her regardless, whatever the card claimed. She tried the dry goods store first, because she could sew a straight seam faster than most women twice her size, and the man behind the counter had flour on his sleeves and looked like he needed help. He heard her out, arms crossed, and then said the position had been filled that morning. She tried the boarding house next, offering to cook and clean in exchange for a room, and the landlady said she was full up, though the sign in the window said otherwise both times Leanne passed it that week. She was standing outside the assay office, wondering if there was a single business in Silver Bend that had not already decided her answer before she opened her mouth, when a horse came down the street at an easy trot, a big, dark brown gelding with a white sock on one leg, ridden by a man who sat it like the animal was an extension of his own spine. He reined up outside the feed store, not 10 feet from where she stood, and swung down. He was tall, sun-browned, dressed like every other rancher she had passed that week, except that he looked at her the way almost nobody else in Silver Bend had bothered to. Straight on. Like she was a person standing on a boardwalk instead of a problem he needed to walk around. "Ma'am," he touched his hat brim, "you look like a woman who's been asking around town and not getting anywhere." Is it that obvious? She had thought her face gave nothing away after 6 refusals, but apparently a stranger on a horse could read her plainer than she wished. "You've got the walk of someone who's been turned down 4 times before lunch." He tied off the horse to the rail. "I'm guessing 5 by now." 6. She had stopped counting the polite refusals and started counting only the ones that bothered to give a reason. Ezra Callahan. He held out a hand, and after a moment she took it. His grip was careful, like a man used to being stronger than the thing he was shaking hands with. "I run a spread about 4 miles east of here. Callahan cattle, if anyone in town's mentioned it." "They have not mentioned much of anything to me." She said it without bitterness, only fact. Leanne Tam. "Mrs. Tam." He glanced at the black band on her sleeve, the only mourning she had been able to afford, and did not ask about it, which she counted in his favor. "You looking for work, or looking for a way out of Silver Bend?" "Work. I have nowhere else that wants me badly enough to buy the ticket." He was quiet a moment, studying her the way she imagined he studied a horse he was thinking of buying, which she found she did not mind, because at least he was thinking about it rather than simply saying no. "I'm not hiring," he said finally. Her chest went tight. 6 refusals had not prepared her for a 7th delivered so plainly, by a man who had seemed for one strange minute like he might be different. "I'm asking," he said, before she could turn away. "There's a difference. I've got 400 head, a foreman who can't keep books straight to save his life, and a bunkhouse full of men who won't touch a needle and thread if their shirts fall clean off their backs. I need someone who can read a ledger, mend a seam, and not faint at the sight of a branding iron. That's not a job I'm offering out of charity. That's a job I can't do without, and so far nobody in this town has been fool enough to want it." "Why not?" "Because I pay a widow the same wage I'd pay a man, and Silver Bend doesn't much care for that arithmetic." He said it flat, no heat in it, like a fact about the weather. "You interested, or have I wasted both our afternoons?" She thought of the $3 in her purse, and the boarding house that had no vacancy for her twice, and the 6 shut doors that had come before this one open hand, and she said yes, before she had entirely decided to. The ride out to the Callahan spread took the better part of an hour. Leanne perched on the wagon seat beside a ranch hand named Otis Dray, while Ezra rode ahead on the dark brown gelding, and by the time the house came into view, low and long with a porch running its whole front, she understood 2 things. First, that this was not a small operation, whatever Ezra's plain talk suggested. Second, that every man they passed in the yard stopped what he was doing to watch her climb down from the wagon, and none of them looked pleased about it. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Purdy Voss, met them at the porch steps with his hat pushed back and his mouth already working before Ezra had both boots on the ground. "This is the help." "This is Mrs. Tam. She's going to sort out the books you've been butchering since March, and she'll take over the mending on top of it." "The men won't like a woman going through the accounts." "The men don't have to like it. I do the hiring on this ranch, Purdy, same as I always have." Ezra's voice did not rise, but something in it closed the subject like a door. "Show her the office, and somebody get her trunk off that wagon before Dray decides it's easier to leave it in the yard." Purdy did not argue further, though the look he gave Leanne on his way past was not one she planned to forget. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of men on the rail line who had decided, long before she opened her mouth, exactly what a Chinese woman traveling alone was worth to them. It had never once meant anything good. The office was a cramped room off the main house, ledgers stacked crooked on a shelf that had clearly not been dusted since before her husband died, let alone since March. Dust hung thick in the light from the one window, and somewhere out past the corral a dog barked twice and gave up. She sat down at the desk that first evening, lit a lamp, and began working through 6 months of Purdy Voss's arithmetic. The heat of the day had not broken by sundown. She worked with her sleeves pinned back and a cloth at her wrist to keep the sweat from smearing the ink, and the lamp drew moths against the glass in slow, stubborn circles. Column after column, feed and tack and wages, and the small cash outlays that kept a working ranch fed and shod, and none of it added up the way 6 years of her husband's own bookkeeping had taught her that honest numbers should. Numbers that were merely careless left a pattern of scatter, a mistake here and a mistake there, spread thin like buckshot. These numbers had a shape to them instead. They leaned one direction only, every error fattening the same set of entries, and a woman who had spent 6 years balancing a rail worker's pay against a rail worker's debts knew the difference between a clumsy hand and a guided one. By the time the lamp burned low, she had found enough errors, some careless and some that did not look careless at all, to fill 4 pages of her own careful notes. She brought them to Ezra the next morning, finding him at the corral fence watching 2 hands work a young horse that did not want to be worked. He read her notes in silence, his jaw setting tighter with every line, and when he reached the 3rd page he went still in a way that made the horse in the corral toss its head, as though it had felt the change in him before she had seen it herself. "These 3 entries," he tapped the page. "Feed purchases. Same supplier, same month, twice the going rate." "I checked the supplier's prices against 2 other ranches' accounts posted at the feed store. Someone is either buying feed badly or buying it well and pocketing the difference." "Purdy handles all the feed contracts." He said it slowly, like a man working out the shape of something he did not want to see clearly yet. "Has for 6 years. I am not accusing anyone. I am telling you what the numbers say." "The numbers say plenty." He folded the pages and put them inside his coat. "Keep this between us for now, and keep doing exactly what you're doing." The days took on a shape. Mornings in the office with the ledgers, afternoons mending shirts and harness leather in the shade of the bunkhouse porch, where the ranch hands mostly ignored her, which she had learned to prefer over the alternative. Ezra checked on her work most evenings, standing in the doorway of the office with his hat in his hand, asking sharp questions about numbers that most men in Silver Bend would not have thought a woman capable of answering, and listening to her answers like they mattered. On the 6th day, a heifer got loose from the branding pen and came through the yard at a dead run, panicked and heavy enough to break a leg or worse if it struck anyone standing in its path. Leanne had been crossing from the spring house with an armload of linens when she heard the shouting, and turned to find 800 pounds of animal bearing down on her with nowhere to run that would clear it in time. She did the only thing she could think to do, which was to fling the linens wide and shout, a sudden white flare of cloth that spooked the heifer sideways just enough that it thundered past her shoulder instead of through it, close enough that she felt the heat off its flank. Ezra reached her at a run, breathing hard, checking her over with his hands before he seemed to remember himself and stopped. "You didn't move." "There wasn't time to move. There was only time to think of something faster than running." Her heart was still slamming against her ribs. "It worked. That is all that matters." "It worked because you didn't panic." He said it like the observation cost him something to make out loud. Most people freeze solid in front of a stampeding animal. You found a way to turn it aside instead. "I have had practice standing still while large, dangerous things bear down on me and deciding what to do about it." She meant the words lightly, but they landed heavier than she intended, and he did not ask her to explain which large, dangerous things she meant. He only nodded, as though he understood well enough without her saying it plain, and helped her gather up the trampled linens from the dirt. It was on the 9th day that the trouble Purdy had promised in his first look at her finally arrived. She was walking back from the spring house with a bucket of water when 3 of the hands blocked the path in front of her, not by accident. The oldest of them, a lean man named Dutch Albee, who worked closest under Purdy, spat into the dirt near her boots. "Heard you been going through the books, looking for men to blame." "I go through the books because Mr. Callahan asked me to." "My daddy fought Chinamen on the railroad crews for 4 years. Said your kind'll smile at a man's face and cheat him blind soon as his back's turned." "I have not cheated anyone." She kept her voice level, though her grip on the bucket handle had gone white-knuckled, the water inside it trembling with the effort of holding still. "I have found where the cheating already was." Dutch stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on him, though it was not yet noon, and for one long moment she thought he meant to knock the bucket from her hands, or worse, and there was nobody in the yard to see it happen. That was when the sound of hooves came fast around the corner of the barn, the dark brown gelding cutting between Leanne and the 3 men so close that Dutch had to jump back or be run down. Ezra was off the horse before it had fully stopped, and whatever expression was on his face made all 3 ranch hands find something urgent to attend to elsewhere. "Dutch?" His voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse than shouting would have. You've got something to say to me, say it now, to my face, instead of cornering a woman by the spring house when you think nobody's watching." "Wasn't cornering nobody. I've been riding this section for 15 minutes, and I saw exactly what it was." Ezra's hand had not moved toward the pistol at his hip, but Dutch's eyes kept flicking to it anyway. "You want to work for a man who pays fair wages and asks fair questions, you keep your hands and your mouth to yourself around anyone on this payroll. That includes Mrs. Tam. You don't like the arrangement? Purdy can settle your account today, and you can find work somewhere that suits your daddy's opinions better." Dutch backed off, muttering, and the yard emptied fast. Ezra turned to Leanne, and for the first time since she had met him on the boardwalk in town, something in his face was not entirely steady. "You're not hurt?" "No." Her hands were shaking regardless, though she willed them still. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. It shouldn't have happened at all. On my land, under my nose." He took the bucket from her hands, an unnecessary gesture that she let him make anyway. "Purdy put 'em up to it. I'd stake the whole herd on it." They walked back toward the house together, slower than the errand required, the evening starting to cool the way it did once the sun dropped behind the western ridge. Cicadas had begun their steady grind in the grass, and somewhere in the bunkhouse someone was working a harmonica through the same 4 bars of a tune neither of them recognized. "You could send me back to town," she said, after a silence had stretched long enough that she felt she had to fill it with something. "It would be simpler for you. No trouble with Purdy or Dutch or anyone else who doesn't care for the arithmetic." "I could." He did not slow his walk to consider it, which told her more than a long pause would have. "I could also let a man skim my ranch blind because chasing him off would ruffle a few feathers, and I've never run this place by making the easy choice when the honest one was sitting right there in front of me." He glanced at her sideways. "You want to go back to town? I'll drive you myself and settle your wages fair for the day's worked. But don't mistake me sending you back for you being the problem here. The problem's wearing a foreman's hat, and I mean to deal with him proper, in my own time." "I do not want to go back to town." The words came out plainer than she meant them, and she did not take them back. "There's nothing in Silver Bend for me but shut doors." "Then you'll stay," he said, and something in the flatness of it, the same flatness he'd used the day he told her he wasn't hiring, told her the matter was settled as far as he was concerned. "You cannot prove that from a spilled bucket and a drunk man's mouth." "No." He looked toward the barn where Purdy's shadow had disappeared a minute before Dutch had blocked her path, timing that seemed less like coincidence the longer she considered it. "But I can prove it from a ledger, given time, and you're the one who's been finding the proof." It was 2 evenings later that she learned the rest of it, in the quiet that came after the bunkhouse lamps went dark and before her own candle burned to nothing. She had stayed late at the desk, chasing one final discrepancy through 8 months of feed receipts, when Ezra came to the office doorway, not to check her figures, but simply to stand there, hat in hand, in a way that told her the visit was not about the ranch at all. "You asked me once why I hired a widow nobody else in town would touch." He leaned against the doorframe. "I never gave you the honest answer." "You said you needed someone who could read a ledger." "That's true. It's also not the whole truth." He turned his hat over once in his hands. "My wife died 4 years back. Fever, the kind that moves through a house in a week and leaves nothing behind to fight. Everyone in Silver Bend came to the funeral and told me how sorry they were, and then every one of them started treating me like a man who needed managing instead of a man who needed work to do. Nobody offered me a job. Nobody had to. But I know what it looks like when a whole town decides it already knows everything about you before you've said a word. That is not the same as what happened to me on the boardwalk. No, yours is worse, and I know it. I'm not fool enough to think a dead wife and a dead husband and a foreign face carry the same weight in this town's eyes. But I recognize something in the way you were standing outside that assay office, like a person who's had every door shut in her face and is still deciding whether to knock on one more. He met her eyes. I wanted to be the one door that didn't shut. She did not have an answer for that, not one she trusted her voice to carry steadily, so she said nothing at first. Instead, she reached into the drawer of the desk and drew out the one thing she had carried the whole way from Reno that was not strictly useful, a folded square of paper gone soft at the creases from months of handling. She set it on the desk between them without quite deciding to. My husband's last letter to the company office, asking after his back pay before the accident. He never sent it. I found it in his coat after. She smoothed the fold flat with 2 fingers. I have read it more times than I could count, looking for something in it I could carry forward, and all I ever find is a man asking politely for money he had already earned, from people who never intended to give it to him whether he lived or died. I kept it because it is the last thing he wrote in his own hand, not because it holds any wisdom. It only holds him. Ezra looked at the letter but did not touch it, which she understood as its own kind of respect. I don't have anything of my wife's left in a drawer. Burned most of her things after the fever. On the doctor's word, it wasn't safe to keep them. I kept one hairpin, silver, nothing special. It's in a tin on my dresser, and I couldn't tell you why I kept that one thing over anything else, except that a man needs to keep something, or the losing of a person starts to feel like it never happened at all. That is exactly it. She folded the letter back along its worn crease. Something to prove it happened. Something to prove they were real. He did not have an answer for that either. Not right away. And for a moment the two of them simply sat with the lamp burning low between them. 2 people who had each buried someone and kept one small, useless, necessary thing to remember them by. He rose after a while, nodded once as though her silence and her letter together had told him something true, and left her to the last of her candle. In the weeks that followed, Leanne worked the ledgers harder than she had worked anything since her husband's own accounts, tracing the false supplier's name back through 8 months of receipts until she found the one mistake Purdy had not thought to cover, a signature on a delivery slip that matched no hand at the actual feed store in town. She brought the discovery to Ezra in the barn, keeping her voice low, though there was no one within earshot. The cousin who supposedly runs this supply contract. I asked the feed store's own clerk if he knew the name. He had never heard it. There is no cousin, Ezra. There is only Purdy, writing himself a second wage under a name that does not exist. You're certain? He said it not as a challenge, but as a man wanting to be sure of the ground before he stepped onto it. I checked the clerk's own delivery book against the signature on our receipts. They do not match, and they were never meant to. Purdy invented a man to steal from you in plain sight. She kept her voice steady, though the weight of what she was accusing a man of settled heavier with every word. If you confront him with this, and he is desperate enough, he may not go quietly. He won't go quietly regardless. Man who's stolen for 6 years doesn't hand over the proof of it with a smile. Ezra folded the papers and tucked them inside his coat. The same gesture she had come to recognize as him deciding a matter was now beyond discussion. But we're not doing this quiet or careful anymore. We're doing it in front of the whole town, where he can't talk his way around it with the sheriff alone in a back room. Come into Silver Bend with me tomorrow. Bring the ledgers. She did not sleep well that night, turning the coming confrontation over in her mind the way she had once turned over her husband's unsent letter, looking for the version of tomorrow that ended without anyone getting hurt and not quite finding it. The feed contract came apart 3 weeks later, and it came apart loud. Ezra rode into Silver Bend with the full 6 months of records Leanne had assembled, page after page cross-checked against the feed store's own posted prices, showing that Purdy Voss had been billing Callahan cattle for grain at nearly twice the market rate and pocketing the difference through a cousin who ran the supply contract on paper only. He laid it out for the sheriff in the middle of the general store with half the town listening, and Purdy, cornered with nowhere left to talk his way out, did the one thing that made everything worse before it made it better. He grabbed a rifle off the rack by the counter. Leanne had come into town that same afternoon on an errand for the ranch accounts, and she was standing near the door when Purdy swung the rifle up, wild-eyed, shouting that no woman's arithmetic was going to cost him 6 years of skimming a fair man's ranch. Ezra moved without a word, putting himself between the rifle and the room, and for one endless second Leanne thought she was about to watch a second husband die in front of her over a matter of dollars and pride. It was not Ezra who ended it. It was Leanne herself, stepping forward before she had time to be afraid of doing it, snatching a heavy bolt of canvas off the dry goods shelf and swinging it hard into the back of Purdy's knees, buckling him to the floor before the rifle could level. The sheriff had the weapon out of his hands and the irons on his wrists inside of 10 seconds, and the whole store went quiet enough to hear the dust settle. Ezra looked at her across the wreckage of scattered flour sacks and dropped canvas, and something in his face was not gratitude alone. It was closer to seeing her clearly for the first time, though he had claimed, weeks before, to have seen her clearly from the very start. "Where in the world did you learn to swing a bolt of canvas like that?" 6 years married to a rail worker. You learn to move fast or you get left behind at every camp. Her hands were shaking again, worse than the day by the spring house, but she kept her voice even. "I did not plan that. I only knew I was not going to watch it happen to you." "Good thing you didn't plan it. A man who plans a rescue usually gets there a beat too late." He helped her step around the fallen flour sacks. "Come on, let's get you home." Home. He said it plainly, without seeming to notice he had said it at all, and Leanne found she did not want to correct him. 3 months passed, and Silver Bend had changed its mind about a number of things, the way towns do once the story that matters most to them shifts from what a person is to what a person has done. Purdy Voss sat in the territorial jail awaiting trial for fraud, his cousin's supply contract exposed as worthless, and the Callahan Ranch ran its feed accounts at honest prices for the first time in years, every figure balanced by Leanne's own hand. Dutch Albie had not come back to work. 2 of the other hands who had blocked her path that day had, to her genuine surprise, sought her out separately to apologize, awkward and stiff-necked about it, the way men are when they have been made to see something plainly that they had preferred to leave blurred. She had accepted both apologies without making either man grovel for it. There was no profit in that, and she had never much cared for profit that came at someone else's expense. The bunkhouse mending pile had shrunk to almost nothing, not because the men needed fewer clothes, but because half of them had started bringing their shirts to her with an easy nod instead of the wary distance of her first weeks, as if the fight in the general store had settled some question in the ranch's collective mind that no amount of honest bookkeeping alone could have settled. The ranch itself showed the change plainer than any ledger could. Honest feed prices meant 2 more horses in the string come autumn, bought outright instead of financed against a fraudulent contract. The general store in Silver Bend had started extending the Callahan account fair credit again, the owner having decided, once Purdy's fraud came out in the open, that a widow's arithmetic was worth a good deal more to him than whatever his neighbors whispered about her at the counter. And the letter Leanne had once kept folded in a drawer as the last trace of a dead man's hand now sat in a small wooden box on the office shelf beside the settled ledgers, no longer the only thing she had left to prove a life had mattered. She found Ezra at the corral fence on an evening in late September, watching the same young horse from her first morning on the ranch, gentled now, taking a saddle without complaint. "You did that," she said, nodding at the horse. 3 months of patience. Some things can't be rushed. You push a green horse too hard too early, you get a horse that never trusts a hand again. He did not look away from the corral, though something in his voice shifted. "Same is true of most things worth having, I've found." "Is that so?" "It is." He turned to face her fully then, hat off, sun low enough to gild the dust in the yard gold. "I told you once I wasn't hiring, and then I told you I was asking. I've got another question along those same lines, if you'll let me put it to you plain, the way I put the first one." She felt her chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear this time. "Ask it." "I'm not looking for a bookkeeper any more, Leanne. The books are settled, the ranch is honest, and Purdy's cousin isn't coming within 100 miles of my feed contracts again. What I'm asking now has nothing to do with any of that." He held her gaze steady. "I'm asking if you'd stay on this ranch as my wife, not my hired help. I know what this town will say about it, some of it ugly, and I know I can't promise you it'll stop saying it soon. But I can promise you a door that never shuts, same as I promised the first day, and I find I want to promise you a good deal more than that besides." She thought of the $3 she had carried into Silver Bend and the 6 refusals before Ezra Callahan rode down the street on his dark brown horse, and the ledger pages that had uncovered a thief, and the bolt of canvas that had saved a man's life, and she found that the answer had been settling in her for weeks without her fully admitting it to herself. "Yes," she said, steady now, though her heart was not. "I will stay." He did not kiss her in the middle of the corral yard, not with 2 ranch hands still working the far fence line, but he took her hand in both of his, careful, the way he had been careful with it the very first day on the boardwalk, and held it like something he did not intend to let go of again. Behind him the young horse tossed its head once at the fence rail and settled, and the late light lay long and gold across the yard, over the office where her ledgers sat balanced and honest, over the bunkhouse where men now brought her their mending without a second thought, over a ranch that had been quietly, thoroughly remade by the same steady hands that had once carried $3 and a dead man's letter into a town that wanted no part of her. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being